What makes life simple is that the robust and the anti-fragile among us don't have to have as accurate a comprehension of the world as the fragile do. Nassim Nicholas Taleb, Anti-Fragile. Well, hey there, welcome to the show. My name is Roger Whitney. I am your host. Now, this show is dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but have the confidence to rock retirement. And that can be hard with all the craziness in the world and the craziness in our lives. And that's why this month we're focusing on mastering the fundamentals. What are the fundamentals? How do I practice them so I can work towards mastery? That's been the theme of this month. And we're in week, 1, 2, 3. First week, we talked about the reasons why your process needs to be agile. And then the second week of the month, we talked about how to create a vision for your life, because that has to drive everything. And then in week 3, we talked about how to organize your resources and the things you need to do to get an idea of whether this vision is feasible given the resources you have. And then this week, I guess this is week 4, isn't it? Once you have a feasible vision, we need to figure out how do we make your vision resilient so you don't get knocked off course easy. So that's what we're going to talk about. In addition to that, we're going to have Kevin Lyles, our head retirement coach in the Rock Retirement Club, come on and talk about fundamentals. So let's get started here, eh? This show is sponsored by Boomer Benefits. We speak Medicare. Now, Boomer Benefits is a Medicare guide, and Medicare is one of those decisions that is pretty important because the decisions you make when you qualify for Medicare can follow you for years to come. And the cool thing about Boomer Benefits is, 1, they have the heart of a teacher. 2, it's 100% free to you because they're paid by the insurance companies, whether you use them or not. And in my practice, we use Boomer Benefits with clients that are navigating that Medicare decision. So I think they're a safe place. We've had a lot of great experiences. So go check out Boomer Benefits at boomerbenefits.com/RAM. So over the last few months, I've been working with a teammate on creating an SOP, a standard operating procedure for Agile Retirement Management. And this gentleman has a military background. He's a very organized project management mindset kind of person. And so he is the project manager on this. And we've been iterating weekly and flushing out the big stages of retirement management, the steps within each stage and the sub-steps within each of those steps, as well as the resource that is used for each one of those baby steps. Looking at it from a 1,000-foot view and seeing the entire outline and all the little baby steps, knowing that there's things to do even within those baby steps, can be really intimidating. It can really look like a lot. And in some ways, it is a lot. And I don't want you to get overwhelmed, because if I'm feeling overwhelmed as we do this and really flush it out on paper, I can imagine you're getting overwhelmed as we go through these fundamentals week by week. So I want you to give yourself some grace, because although it looks really big, every little step is very achievable. You can do these if you do them incrementally, realizing that you don't need to get them perfect on the first pass, because they're going to become something that is a practice that you do over and over again as you walk this journey and your life changes. So I just don't want you to get overwhelmed as we talk through all this stuff, because it's very achievable if you're a little bit organized and you give yourself some grace and don't worry about trying to get it right the first time, okay? So just wanted to make sure I said that. Now, last week, we looked at the resources you had and we matched them to your vision for your life to get to a feasible plan. And feasible is important. So imagine you have a boat and you know it's large enough and you have the fuel and you have the food and you have some know-how to get you across the Atlantic Ocean. So you can sit there at shore and say, I know this is feasible for me to do this given the resources that I have. That's what the feasible step says. Yeah, you could do this. Lots of caveats, but you probably wouldn't embark on that journey without doing some work to make sure that it's resilient, because life happens, right? If you're on the ocean going across the Atlantic, a huge storm could come in and knock out your radar and take you off course, right? Or the engine could break, or you could get a hole in the hull. All sorts of things could happen that would make this feasible journey suddenly not feasible at all, because life happens. So even if you're going to go on the journey across the Atlantic, you would probably want to do some things to make it resilient. Maybe have some engine parts, maybe have a backup radar, or know how to fix the radar or sonar or whatever they use, so you don't get knocked off so easily. Well, it's the same in your retirement plan. Just because you have a feasible plan based on some analysis by software doesn't mean that it's resilient. And I think we lose this step a lot because we forget what we're trying to solve for. Right? What are we trying to solve for in retirement? We're not trying to solve for optimizing every dollar, although that would be nice. We're trying to solve to make sure your life outcomes, that trip you want to do every year for 10 years with the family, is you're able to do it, one, but also that trip doesn't hurt you way down when you're 85 and you don't realize it until then. So we're trying to solve for your outcomes, right? You want to solve for the outcomes of your life, not necessarily optimizing every dollar. And I think we lose that perspective a lot, and I don't want you to. So in this resilient stage that we're going to talk about, I want to introduce the concept of something called slack. And I'm not meaning the communication tool. What I'm referring to is slack, like not tense or taut, like a rope. If you think of a rope that's pulled really tight, that's taut. You're utilizing every ounce of that rope's length and strength, etc. That's optimized, I guess. But it's going to put it in the position that it could snap or it could jerk things around. It makes it a little bit fragile. Whereas if you have some slack, it gives a little bit. It doesn't put so much pressure on it. So when an unexpected jolt comes, it's more apt to hold. And I think this idea of slack in your retirement plan is critical to having that confidence that, hey, I can do this. I'm okay if we get knocked off course. I'm going to have options. Now, in retirement planning, the slack can come from a lot of different sources, but one of the main sources it's going to come from is either liquidity or guaranteed payments, either having a lot of cash that you can get to quickly or guaranteed payments that sort of smooth things out. And it becomes a Goldilocks exercise, right? We don't want it too taut. We don't want too little of these things, but we don't want too much either. And that's more of an art than science. But we're going to walk through how to think through that. And this is a fundamental thing we want to do in rocking retirement. Okay, so what can knock you off course in retirement? What are some of the things? And we'll define them here. Well, number one is something called sequence of return. So sequence of return acknowledges the fact that you don't get the same return every single year. So if we were to say, look at equities and call it the S&P 500 index, and let's make the assumption it has an average return of 9% a year. And that is the average, we'll say, but we know that we don't get the average every single year, right? Some years we'll get 20%, other years we'll get negative 10%, and actually all over the place. Historically, rarely do we receive a return that's even close to the average. And that is essentially what sequence return looks at. It says, hey, if I get bad returns early in my retirement, when I have the longest time frame, that could really hurt me. So let's assume you're going to take a 4% withdrawal rate on $1 million. Well, I have $1 million. I take out 4% at the beginning of the year. So that gives me $960,000. And then we lose 10% of that $960,000. Now we're in the $800,000 range. So next year, when we look at doing a 4% withdrawal, it's going to be on a much smaller number than original million. And if we have a couple bad years in a row, early in retirement, we can really get ourselves in a pickle. So that is what sequence of return is trying to represent. And this is something that we have to manage for to make our plan resilient. Another one is inflation. And we talked about that last month for the entire month. Inflation hurts you on the front end, but it can really, really hurt you later in life. So we got to manage on inflation because we don't know what future inflation is going to be. Another thing that can knock us off course is a life event. Someone passes away early. Remember Dom's story of his wife passing suddenly that he shared a few months ago. That is a life event that could happen. A long-term care event, either now or in the future. I have a friend who's in his late 50s and his wife has early onset Alzheimer's. That's a life event that has changed the trajectory of his financial life, not to mention the personal part. A child needing assistance, either now or in the future, a grandchild needing assistance. All these things can come and knock us off course. So we need to have some slack to make our life resilient. And the last thing I'll mention briefly that can knock you off course, and this is probably the most likely one of all of these, is just simply you're going to change your mind about what you want. In my experience, over doing this for 25 plus years, that's the thing that's likely going to happen. You're going to cast this vision of what you want and have it be feasible. And then a year or two into it, you're going to change your mind. We've decided we're going to move across country. We've decided we want 2 homes. We've decided that we're going to buy a house for our children. You reorganizing your life is the most likely thing that's going to happen. And so that's one reason why we want to have slack in your financial life, so you have tools that you can easily use to reorient all your money to whatever the new vision for you is in the future, especially if you're early in retirement, right? We're always reinventing ourselves. So those are the things that can knock you off course. All right. One other concept I want to make sure you grasp as we're working on making your plan resilient, right? That is, and I've said this before, but I want to distinguish, put a harder line between what these are, and that is return on your money, right? Where you earn money on your money through dividends and interest and market gains. We definitely want to earn money on your money during retirement, right? Because we know we need to plan for future events. But that is very different than return of your money, meaning getting your money back so you can use it. Both of those are very important and they're very different. And if you conflate them, you can hurt the resilience of your plan. So return on your money, I got to earn money, and return of my money. I need my money so I can go spend on my life. Those are 2 very different things. With that as a foundation, let's talk about some of the steps you want to take to make your plan more resilient and put some of this slack in your plan to absorb the shocks that could happen on your journey. A good way to do that is to take your feasible plan and stress test it against some of the more common things like we've talked about. If you're married or have a partner, one good stress test is to look at what happens if either of you pass away prematurely. And you can create what-if scenarios from your feasible plan saying, what happens if partner A passes away? How does that impact our spending and our cash flow? Because we have things like Social Security that will change, potentially a pension or human capital or part-time work that will change. So we want to stress in a couple situation, what happens if one of us dies early? How does that impact the feasibility of this plan? Another one is going to be one that we think about a lot, which is, what happens if we have a long-term care event? What happens if, as a single person, I have a long-term care event when I'm 70 or when I'm 80, and we want to put some numbers around what that event might look like, simulate it in the feasible plan to see what that does to the trajectory of the retirement plan. Will you be okay financially? Or if you're married, will your spouse be okay financially? We're actually just about to go into production in creating what we call a long-term care decision pod, which walks you through step by step how to make the decision about this topic. But we want to stress test the plan to see how resilient it is to that kind of event. You could also stress test for a reduction in pension, a reduction in Social Security, and then we're always trying to stress test against sequence of return and inflation against the plan. And the way you do that structurally, if you're using a, say, planning tool, a software, you can create a what if scenario based off of your feasible plan and say, well, what if I add this event and the consequences of this event? What does that do to the analysis of our fundedness level? That number we talked about last week. Even if you're using a spreadsheet, you can do exactly the same thing. You can say, here's my spreadsheet as to what my feasible plan is. Let me add in this event and these expenses happening because, say, a long-term care event happened. And what does that do to my numbers? The one that you really can't model in a spreadsheet is going to be that sequence of return. I mean, you could, but it's not very easy. And that's probably one of the largest ones that we want to worry about. And that's one reason why Monte Carlo scenarios are such a good tool, because it can help do that very quickly. So once we've stress tested the feasible plan against these things to see how naturally resilient it is against some of these potential shocks, the next thing we want to do is we want to start thinking about and determining what our style is in terms of how we like to fund life. So if you think of a fuel gauge that goes from all the way to one extreme at 3 o'clock to the other extreme at 9 o'clock, let's think of that gauge when we're using terms about the way that we withdraw money. So one way that we withdraw money is something called the systematic withdrawal rate, which is like the 4% rule. That is, I take X percent out of my assets every single year. That is one that is embracing markets and long-term averages and just taking out money as I need it. So that would be, say, at the 3 o'clock on our dial. All the way on the other extreme at the 9 o'clock is going to be the style which we would call safety first. One that was, I think, first said by Wade Pfau, or one that he uses often, which is very conservative. It's not so much focused on taking money as I need it, but creating secure cash flows to cover life each and every year. So on the extreme level, you would have guaranteed payments, perhaps through annuities, or you would buy tips to match your spending for every single year in retirement. And you would give up almost all upside of potential markets, or a lot of it. So you had, as best as you can, certainty that each and every year you're going to have X amount of money to spend regardless of what happens in markets. So that would be the other extreme. So if that's one side of the scale, and the other side is systematic withdrawals, which is just embracing an investing mentality, there's a lot of in between there. Almost everybody is a hybrid within those two extremes. And this is important when you're figuring out how to make your plan resilient, because you want your plan to match you so that you can feel comfortable with it and confident in it. Regardless of what one makes sense quantitatively, you definitely want it to fit you from a qualitative standpoint so you can feel comfortable. You're not a square peg in a round hole. And so the way that you identify your withdrawal strategy is going to be twofold. First, it's going to be the quantitative measure of what tools are available to you. And this is going to be determined by your fundedness. If you are highly constrained, meaning, hey, this is feasible, but it's, can be a little volatile. One thing goes wrong financially and the numbers don't work really quickly. That would be a very constrained retirement plan. Even if it says it's feasible, it can get knocked off course really quickly. Or perhaps you're underfunded, meaning you don't have enough money for the goals and there's not a lot of leverage that you have there from a financial standpoint. Well, if that's the case, the tools in your toolbox are going to lean very heavy towards safety first, meaning guaranteed payments and guaranteed outcomes. And that is a little counterintuitive, because if you think of yourself as constrained and you need more money, say, to make the plan work or be more resilient, you would think, well, maybe I should get more returns. That's the natural thing that some people would think. And actually, it's the opposite, because in that situation, you don't have as much of a ability to accept the downside because you're so close from a constrained standpoint. The plan is so tight that, yes, you do need returns. That would be great. But if you have the bad result, of markets going down or inflation spiking, it can make a bad or a rough situation even worse. So if you're highly constrained, you actually need to be a little bit more safe because you can't afford to lose what you got, essentially. And then on the other extreme, if you are way overfunded by using the tools that we talked about last week, you could literally just sell investments as you need the money because you have so much excess money that if we have bad markets, you should likely not get to a point where it really impacts you from a resiliency standpoint. So you have all the tools. You can be safety first, you can be systematic withdrawal, or anywhere in between. And so everybody falls on a spectrum. Rarely are we on the extremes. So from a quantitative standpoint, I think it's important to understand which ones make the most sense given how feasible my plan is. Now, what about the qualitative aspect of it? The personality and preferences, how you're wired, or how your spouse is wired if you're married, play a big role in this. And I have seen this in my practice where someone from purely a number standpoint is way overfunded, meaning they could easily just be fairly aggressive with their investments and sell as they need the money. And it doesn't matter how bad the markets could get. It shouldn't really impact their life from a cash flow standpoint. But because of their personality and their preferences, we went for more guaranteed payments and leaned more towards a safety first approach because it fit who they were. Even if they could handle it financially, they didn't want to go on the roller coaster. They just didn't enjoy it. It caused more stress, even if intellectually they knew they would be fine. So you're going to want to have a chat with yourself and be real with yourself and think about where you fit within this spectrum. Now, there are tests you can take, the DISC profile, which is a personality assessment, the Enneagram, which is a personality assessment. And I've used those to help reflect who I am and my preferences. And there's a newer one called the RISA, RISA, which is focused on helping identify your retirement style. That one came out here within the last year. So there's more work being done to help do self-assessment from a personality standpoint. But I think you just want to get to a spot where you at least have a sense of where you're at. Knowing that as you implement this stage of the process, like all the stages, as you start to walk the journey, you can always change. If you realize, oh, wow, this is actually safer. I'm more comfortable with downturns than I thought. Or, ooh, no, I need more safety than I thought. This isn't an exact science. So this is just a baseline to help inform how you complete this stage. There's no one right answer. Okay, so once you've done some risk assessment and stress tested the plan, and we talked about what is our style, now we want to put together a cash flow model, which is essentially a cash flow plan that is going to outline all of your income and all of your expenses divided by needs, wants, and wishes for the next 5 to 8 years, broken down by needs, wants, and wishes, and then the income sources. And then you want to have a tax estimate in there based on your income. So next you want to build that medium-term cash flow model with the goal of identifying how much of a deficit is there each year. Because in this cash flow model, you're likely going to have a deficit, right? While you're working, you've had income to pay all those expenses. In retirement, you're going to have no income or little income, but you're still going to have the expenses. So we want to identify how much is not going to be covered by social capital, that pension or Social Security. How much is not going to be covered by my human capital, any part-time work or consulting that you do? How much do I actually need to get from my accounts in order to pay for my life? And that's what this midterm cash flow model is going to do. It's going to help you see year by year how much you need to get from your funds. So once you've built that model, now you can start to make some choices, right? You might change what your pension choice is in terms of the starting date, so you can change that income number in your cash flow model. This is where you're going to optimize or make your initial Social Security decision. If I'm married, do we both take it at full retirement, or does one take it at full retirement and the other takes it at 70? If you're single, when do you take it to maximize the plan? And then whether you're going to work or not. This is where you're going to make that decision. when I look at this model, if I add a little bit of income, it's going to change this cash flow model by such and such. So this is where we want to just work through each one of those so we can finalize what this 5 to 8 year cash flow model is, because that's going to help us build resiliency into the plan when we get to what do we actually do with our money now that we know how much we need from it year by year. Are we tracking along here? So once we've done all that, now we can go to our accounts, our savings accounts, our 401ks, our investment accounts, etc., and define what do we do with all of this money to fund our life. And usually this is where we all want to start. So this is where the concept of what we call the pie cake comes into play. So a pie cake, let me explain where that came from and why I like that term. So a pie cake essentially is a pie with layers, like a cake has layers. And the reason it came up with that is most likely as you've invested throughout your life, you've done an asset allocation, right? You've taken a little questionnaire, whether it's in your 401k, and then you've mixed different assets, stocks and bonds and international stocks, maybe real estate. And generally, that asset allocation is represented like a pie chart, right? With different flavors to represent all the different investment classes of real estate and stocks, etc. And that's how we've invested in the accumulation phase. And we've only needed one pie chart because the goal didn't have a big time frame on it. It was just simply long term. Keep investing, add money, don't look at it, rebalance. We had one real time horizon, which was just grow the money over the long term. Well, in retirement, life's a little bit different, right? Because as you've seen, if you've created this 5-year cash flow model, hey, I'm going to need money in the first year to pay me my paycheck because I don't have this work anymore. And I'm going to have to get it from my accounts. And then in year 2, same thing. I'm going to need to grab money from my investments to pay for my life. You're taking all this deferred income that you saved and grew and invested, and now you need to actually pay yourself that income. And so that means that you have multiple time frames for this money. On the short term, you're much more concerned with the return of your money than return on your money. Because if you need, say, $100,000 next year to pay for your retirement life and you don't have any income, so it has to come from your assets, it's pretty important that $100,000 is available to you, which means we care more about the return of our money than return on our money. And that is true really for the first 5 years of life. We care about the return of our money more than trying to make it grow. So that means it's going to have a different allocation or pie chart than money that we know is really for our 80-year-old self, right? Because that can still be very long term. So that's where the concept of a pie cake comes from, is that we're going to have these different pie charts or allocations based on the timing of when I think I'm going to need the money. And so what are those different layers? So the first layer that you want to determine is what we call the contingency fund, which is like an emergency fund. This is just money for a rainy day that sits in a cash account or a high-yielding money market account that we don't really have a name for it in terms of what its purpose is other than to be there if we need it. So that's going to be your first layer, and that's going to be like cash, right? It's got to be super safe. The second layer is going to be what we call the floor layer. And this is going to be monies that is going to fund your life for at least the next 5 years. So in theory, if you needed $100,000 in each of the next 5 years to fund your life because you don't have the income for it, you would have $500,000 in the floor layer. And those monies would be invested in things that would maybe give you a yield, like a bond that matured on a certain date or a money market account, because we're more concerned about the return of our money than we are on our money because we know we're going to need it. When you're in year 3, you want to make sure you can pay your bills and pay for life. So we don't want to put that money at risk. So that's the second layer of this pie cake, which is still concerned about the return of your money for at least 5 to 8 years. Now, the next layer is what we're going to call the upside layer. This is money that you're not going to need for a minimum of 6 years. So now we have a longer time frame. So this money can be a different pie chart allocation of more equities. Now we're starting to get concerned about the return on our money to try to earn money and interest and dividends and hopefully capital gains, etc. And that is going to have a much more aggressive allocation, potentially a very aggressive allocation. And then the last layer, which is not one that everyone has, is what we'll call longevity money. That longevity layer is going to be money that is really for your much more future self, your 80-year-old self. And this might be in a deferred income annuity. It might be in a very aggressive portfolio that you plan on converting to something for guaranteed income later on. And each of us are going to have our own stylistic, quantitative profile, but also qualitative profile. And so no one pie cake or allocation between these layers is going to look exactly the same because you are different than everybody else. You have goals and you have resources and you have preferences, and we want to make your plan resilient so you can actually meet the cash flows of your life in retirement. So what's the goal of this resilient exercise? Well, obviously manage risk, but we want to allow you to be sitting here today and have confidence. Hey, I know how I'm paying for my life for the next 5 years. And I also know, because I have all that liquidity, that if I change my mind or if something comes out of left field, I have a lot of money that's relatively safe. I have slack to be able to make adjustments and reorient myself. And then I know I have money that's invested long-term that's going to help me with inflation, but is going to be really volatile. So this puts you in a position to be much more resilient as you walk this journey. So you can have confidence to spend today because you've already pre-funded that spending in a meaningful way. So this is the resilient phase. Now, next week, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, okay, what are some initial optimization things that you can do? Because we don't want to just put all this money under the mattress, right? We have taxes, we have all sorts of things that we want to try to optimize to make our money last longer. So we're going to address that next week. But now let's go chat with our head retirement coach, Kevin Lyles, about how to make your life resilient from a non-financial perspective. All right, it's that time of the month where we have Coach's Corner with our head retirement coach in the Rock Retirement Club, Kevin Lyles. Kevin, how you doing, buddy?
Doing great, Roger.
I heard that you are having, how shall I say it? You're leaning into a role at the moment.
I am. My wife and I are bonding. And this led me to what I want to talk to you about this month. You know, you've been talking a lot about being agile, being resilient on the financial side, because things can occur that make you change your plans. And I want to talk about it's equally important to stay resilient on the non-financial side of retirement. And I'll talk about what's going on now in a minute. But as soon as I retired, a month later, I needed to get back surgery. And that really put a freeze on some travel plans that we had had. But more importantly, I couldn't do the day-to-day things that I had planned to do. I could no longer go to the gym. I couldn't golf. I couldn't ride a bike. So I had a big hole in my calendar. And so what I did was I decided to pivot. And that's when I began studying retirement planning. And later that same year, I had recovered and we were just getting back to normal in some of the travel we wanted to do. And my mother-in-law suffered an injury that she never recovered from. And it trivializes her death to talk about what it did to our retirement plans. But a parent's death really leaves a huge emotional void. And it disrupts all the plans that you had with that parent. And so we really had to pivot there. And that was a big change. And obviously, we're still not over emotionally. That's losing someone like that. But your plans need to change.
Two really big events right there, right? Right after retirement. Obviously, your mother-in-law, and then your back. When you hurt your back and you couldn't, because you're an active dude.
Yeah.
Golf, pickleball. You're out there doing stuff. How was your psyche when you were like, I can't do all the things that I want?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I didn't notice it that much because I was coming right out of my working life when I wasn't doing those things as much.
You just hadn't started them yet.
Yeah. Now, if I have to take 2 days off, I'm nervous. I don't know what to do with myself. But then it wasn't that big an effect. But I did feel like it was sort of putting my retirement on hold. That was the feeling I had.
Yeah. And as you know, I pinched a nerve in my neck back in January, and it's a lot better. In fact, it is improving. But I remember when we had the meetup for Retirement Plan Live, I could hardly hold my head up and was in pain.
Yeah.
And I had to really work at not being mad.
Oh, sure. It does affect your whole outlook on life. And I remember watching that Retirement Plan Live, Roger, and I felt pain for you because it was obvious you were in pain, the way you were twitching and moving around, because I had gone through the same thing with my back. You just can't get comfortable. And when it hits you, it's a jolt of pain.
Do you think in some ways that's what spurred you going into your research on retirement and ultimately being on here with me today?
Well, I think it wasn't because I thought I needed to change that. It was just I had all that free time on my hands, and that was something I had thought about doing. And so I got into it. And so, I probably would not have done it, but for that injury or that illness period.
So in some ways, that back injury helps you find something that is a big part of your identity in retirement.
That's exactly right. Not all of the changes that you need to be resilient about in retirement are negatives. Those two that I mentioned, negatives. But there are also unexpected opportunities that arise in retirement that you wouldn't have had the freedom to explore during your work life that now you can. And after I studied retirement planning and retirement coaching, you gave me the opportunity to become a coach in the Rock Retirement Club. And that's been a huge change for the good in my life. I get to help people. I've got a purpose of helping people with their retirement transitions. It's led to a number of speaking engagements, and I enjoy talking. So that's been good. It's let me become an author of my own retirement course. That was fun. And a chance to travel around and participate in retirement research. So it's been a huge positive change in my life that in retirement, these kinds of changes, these kinds of events in your life seem to happen more often. Maybe they happen when you're working. You just don't have time to appreciate and either suffer through them or take advantage of them.
When I look back on my life, and I'm guessing you would be the same, most people might, when I look at the major steps forward in my life, a lot of them come from some type of adversity. Yeah. It was some pain or something that was a little pointed at the time that I probably wouldn't want to go through again. And it's what I did with that harvested some major growth for me. Some coaching that I'm doing on the side, they would call that a hero bar, that you have to think back and create hero bars, which are essentially these little things that the nutritional bars that you eat. So when you're going through something, you can look back and say, oh, I remember when I went through that back injury and how painful that was, but look at this cool thing that came from it. So you can sort of fortify yourself when the inevitable detour comes.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll get now to the story about what's going on with my wife now, but obviously in 2020, everyone had an event happen to us, COVID.
Yeah.
And talk about the disruption in retirement plans. It just set them on edge for quite a while. So now we go into 2022, things are getting back to normal on the COVID front. And my wife needed to have rotator cuff surgery. And so I was sort of coaching her, because she was dreading it. And I was saying, oh, it won't be that bad. We'll do it. Well, what I hadn't realized was that after you have that, she can't drive for 6 weeks. So I'm now a chauffeur. She can't do a lot of things. She's got one arm now. So I'm a caregiver now, and I'm happy to do it. But it was amazing. It did not occur to me till the day after the surgery that, my life is now on hold for 6 weeks because I've got to be there to help and support her. It's just another one of those events in retirement. And she's doing fine, by the way. And she seems to like my caregiving, my cooking, not so much. But caregiving, she seems to be happy with the way I'm doing so far. But the point is, these things happen a lot in retirement, both positive and negative events. They seem to come up more. And you have to be resilient. You can't get too set in your plans. When your plans are disrupted, you can't get upset by that. You need to just roll with the punches, stay agile, and stay resilient.
I love that. And it sounds like your wife's surgery has made possible is for you to lean into a part of yourself and strengthen that relationship. So bravo for you, buddy.
That's true. And hopefully in a few months, I'll have a new pickleball partner. So
there you go. Thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Sure.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step you can take in the next 7 days to rock retirement and, hey, rock life. All right, in the next 7 days, what I want you to do is I want you to understand how much liquidity you have on your balance sheet. How much do you have in cash or very, very safe assets? If you're within 5 years of retirement, you want to start building more cash reserves. If you're within 10 years of retirement, you're probably going to have your normal emergency fund. But I want you to know what that level is, because if you have too little relative to how close you are to retirement, that's something you want to take care of, right? That's the Goldilocks. Hey, this one is way too cold. But if you have way too much liquidity, too much cash or cash-like investments because you don't know what to do with it, well, now you're the opposite. You're way too hot. And you want to make sure your money is working for you. So whether you're too cold or you're too hot, you want to know that so you can figure out what can I do to put this money to work so you can work towards an amazing retirement. So go check those liquidity levels, will you? So we just focused on April. So April's shows are going to be all listener questions. We've had a lot coming in and we want to try to get to as many as we can. So we're going to focus on listener questions and I'll do some deep dives on some things for sure. With that, I hope you're enjoying your spring wherever you are, and we'll chat next week, okay? Hey, it's time for that all-important disclaimer. We so appreciate you listening to the show and love your questions and love the teaching that we're able to provide here. And actually, it helps us too. But remember, you're not our clients.
Not love it if you took advice from us on the show.
We would not love it if you took advice from us on the show. Realize this is helpful in education. Talk to your legal advisor, your tax advisor, or your financial advisor before you make any decisions.
We appreciate you joining us today for this episode of Retirement Answer Man. Be sure to visit rogerwhitney.com/answers to access the Retirement Answer Library with over 30 checklists to help you make the most of the only life you have. Remember, you have more power than you realize to create an amazing life starting today with Retirement Answer Man. The opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance referenced is historical and no guarantee of future results. All indices are unmanaged and may not be invested into directly. Have a wonderful day.